What if the person you're grieving is still alive? And what if that person is you? Stay tuned as we tackle this topic.
Before we begin, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This isn't a podcast about quick fixes, positive thinking, or pretending the past didn't happen. These conversations are designed to challenge the way you understand yourself, your relationships, your nervous system, and the survival strategies that shaped your life. The goal of this podcast is to translate trauma into language that makes sense, so you can better understand your experiences, recognize your patterns, and explore yourself with greater clarity and compassion. This podcast is intended for educational and personal growth purposes. It is not a substitute for therapy, mental health treatment, medical care, or crisis support. If you find yourself becoming emotionally overwhelmed, please consider pausing the episode, practicing self-care, and reaching out to a qualified mental health professional for additional support. Healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about understanding who survival required you to become, and discovering who you are underneath the armor. If you're ready to have honest conversations, ask difficult questions, and explore what it truly means to heal, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This is where survival ends, and choices begin.
Hi, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. My name is Alicia Lynch.
I'm Cody. What's up?
If you've never heard of our podcast before, we tackle topics that generally pertain to complex trauma in some way. So most of us were taught that grief begins when someone dies. But today we're going to look at what if the person that you're grieving is you? What if you're grieving your inner child or the child that you never got to be? The years that you spent surviving instead of living? The career that you might have pursued if you'd believed in yourself? The relationships that you might have had closeness, hadn't felt so scary? Or the good relationship you may have had you actually thought you were worth something? The family that you needed, but you never really got to experience? The emotions that you learned not to feel, or the version of yourself that you might have become if life had been different. But then there's another kind of grief, the grief that comes when you finally understand what happened. So sometimes decades later, you finally have words for the trauma, the adaptations, the self-blame, the people-pleasing, the hyper-independence, the coping mechanisms, and the loss of self. And there's relief in finally understanding this. But there can also be anger, because understanding it now, it doesn't give you your years back. It doesn't restore the opportunities that were lost. It doesn't create a childhood that you needed. It doesn't make the people who didn't show up suddenly come. And it didn't give you the conversation, the apology, or the relationship. They may no longer be possible. So what do you do with that grief? How do you mourn the person you had to become without hating them for surviving? How do you grieve the person that you didn't get to become without spending the rest of your life chasing an imaginary version of yourself? How do you acknowledge what happened without turning the people who hurt us into villains, or turning ourselves into our very own villain? Let's talk about that kind of grief and how it doesn't have a funeral. The grief of life that you lived, the life that you lost, the person that you might have been. This is the war within. So talking about grieving the person that you had to become and the one that you did not get to become. This is a pretty heavy topic. And there's a lot that goes into this, and there's a lot that we grieve that we don't necessarily even know that we're in that process, or we're grieving in general. So a person can grieve themselves in several overlapping ways. Like I said, the childhood, that can be for some people because they recognize, what that child endured or what they needed, they deserved, or they've never received. The person that they might have become. This grief is for your unlived self. Who would I have been if I had grown up feeling safe? Would I have been more confident, adventurous, trusting, creative, outspoken? The person that you had to become, the hyper independent one, the caretaker, the achiever, the invisible one, the peacekeeper, the person who never needed anything. These adaptations may have protected you, but it may also costed you parts of yourself. Lost time. This is huge. This is one I've struggled with. Years spent surviving, worrying, recovering, people pleasing, remaining in unhealthy relationships, hiding, or simply trying to get through the day. There can be a brutal realization of I can't get those years back. Lost opportunities, education, careers, friendships, relationships, travel, creativity, parenthood experiences, financial choices, changes that didn't pursue or get pursued because fear and survival were running the show. The body that you lived in. Some people grieve how long their body braced for danger, with poor sleep, chronic tension, exhaustion, panic, disassociation, or constantly being on alert. There's sometimes anger toward the body before understanding what it was trying to do. Your innocence. Not only childhood innocence, but you can grieve the version of yourself who believed certain people were safe. You can believe love meant something different, or you hadn't learned how cruel life could be sometimes. Your own voice. All the times that you wanted to say no, but instead you said yes. The boundaries that you didn't know that you were allowed to have. Opinions that you swallowed. Needs that you learned not to express. Your identity. This is an upcoming book that I'm working on. Once survival strategies begin falling away, there can be an unexpected grief. If I'm not the caretaker, the fixer, the strong one, the achiever, the peacemaker, or the person that everyone depends upon, then who am I? Relationships that you may have thought that you had. Healing can change how someone understands their parents, partners, siblings, friendships, or your family system. Sometimes you're grieving not only the person, but the relationship you believe existed. People who are still alive. You can grieve someone you're still speaking to because you're finally accepting that they may never become, the parent, the partner, the sibling, or the friend that you needed them to be. And this is often described as what they call ambiguous grief. This leads me to the workbook, which if you go to www.unapologeticallyreborn, under this episode, you'll have YouTube links that you can click on. And underneath that episode will be, it'll say workbook. Click it and it automatically downloads to whatever device you're on. So these terms will be in that workbook. The fantasy of someday. Someday mom will understand. Someday dad will apologize. Someday my partner will finally choose me. Someday my family will acknowledge what happened. Acceptance can mean grieving the future that you kept waiting for, the choices survival made for you. This needs nuance because, people can genuinely regret choices that they made while also understanding the context in which you made them. So healing doesn't require pretending consequences didn't happen. The ways that you treated yourself, years of self-criticism, shame, punishment, addiction, perfectionism, accepting mistreatment, or believing that you were defective. This can bring tremendous sadness once you develop compassion for yourself. So the version of yourself that survived, the one that's fascinating. People sometimes think healing means that they should hate their survival self, but eventually, You may grieve having to let that identity go. This person, they got them there to where they needed to be. Even dysfunctional patterns can feel strange, but safe because they're familiar. Life milestones that weren't what you imagined, weddings, pregnancies, graduations, careers, birthdays, parenting, holidays, things that happen, but maybe trauma prevented them from actually being present from their own lives. So, who were you before a major loss of trauma happened? Who were you before you had a traumatic event? This can be a clear dividing line. Me before this happened and me afterwards. And sometimes the former self really isn't coming back. The fact that healing cannot rewrite history could be the hardest part of grief. Healing can change what happens next, but it can't create the childhood that you didn't have. It can't undo what happened. It can't return lost years or make someone have loved you differently.
How do you know if what you're feeling is actually grief?
Ask yourself, is there a loss underneath this feeling? Anger might contain lost fairness. Jealousy might contain something that you never received. Regret might contain a lost opportunity. Loneliness might contain lost belonging. Sometimes we've been grieving for years without calling it grief.
Why doesn't grief always feel like sadness?
Because grief can look like anger,
Excuse me.
numbness, irritability, exhaustion, yearning, guilt, resentment, withdrawal, difficulty concentrating or constantly replaying the past. And sometimes sadness isn't the emotion that we're most aware of.
Can anger actually be grief?
Excuse me, definitely. Anger can be grief, protesting something that cannot be changed. For an example, why didn't somebody protect me? Why did I lose those years? Why wasn't anyone there? Sometimes underneath I'm furious is really I'm heartbroken. You can grieve the person that you never actually were. And sometimes we don't just mourn the authentic self that trauma buried. We discover that parts of what we considered our personality were adaptations. So I'm just independent. Maybe asking for help in your home wasn't safe. I'm easygoing. Maybe having preferences caused conflict. I don't get attached. So maybe attachment became dangerous. I'm the strong one. Maybe nobody came when you weren't. I don't need anyone. Maybe needing someone repeatedly hurt you. This creates identity grief on its own. And if these things aren't actually me, then who am I? And that question gives you the bridge from grief into healing. So the goal here isn't to discover some pristine, untouched version of yourself that was hiding underneath trauma all along. Life doesn't really work that neatly. It's learning which piece you want to keep, which one you want to thank for helping you to survive, and which no longer serves you and you don't want them to determine your life anymore. Regret says that I wish I had done things differently. Grief says I wish things had been different enough that I could have. And these two things can coexist.
What is consequential grief? Never mind.
It's what happens when one loss contributes to another. So if we were to say, the original loss was connection, losing connection affected belonging. Losing belonging affected identity. Identity affected confidence. Low confidence affected opportunities. And eventually you're grieving a future that was influenced by the original loss. There's the original wound, and then there's everything that the wound touched. So everything that the wound touches, for example, someone may grieve the childhood abuse or neglect itself. But decades later, they may also grieve what living through it costs them, basically. So a child grows up without emotional safety. This is one loss. But maybe that child develops hypervigilance. Hypervigilance makes relationships difficult. They choose partners based on familiarity rather than safety. They remain too long because abandonment feels unbearable. Their career choices are shaped by fear. They struggle to trust. They spend years believing that something is fundamentally wrong with them. And eventually healing begins, and suddenly they're not grieving only childhood anymore. They're grieving the chain reaction. And that can include grieving relationships they entered or stayed in because unhealthy dynamics felt familiar. Education or careers that they didn't pursue because they didn't believe they were capable. Money lost through decisions made during periods of survival or instability. Friendships damaged by withdrawal, mistrust, people pleasing, anger, or difficulty with boundaries. Years spent caring for everyone else while neglecting themselves. Parenting moments when they wish they could, go back and revisit. Opportunities that they avoided because fear looked like intuition. Years that they spent believing distorted things about themselves. Experiences that they technically lived through but weren't emotionally present enough to enjoy. Choices that they made before they understood what was driving those choices. And then this is where shame can sneak into grief. Because grieving what someone did, you can feel different from grieving something that you did afterward. This is where people can get stuck. But I made those choices. Yes. And healing has been able to hold two truths simultaneously. So I am responsible for the choices that I make. And there were reasons I learned to make those choices. Understanding the second doesn't erase the first. It gives it context.
How can one childhood loss create other losses later in life?
Because childhood experiences can shape beliefs and adaptations. So if I learn people leave, I may avoid intimacy. Avoiding intimacy can cost relationships. These relationship losses can reinforce, see, people leave. One wound can create consequences that produce additional grief. So the secondary losses can eventually become bigger than the original loss itself. And so let's do like a metaphor. So imagine dropping a stone into water. The trauma is the stone or the rock. But consequential grief can live in the ripples, so the ripple effect of the water. A person could reach 40 or 50 or 60, 70, 80, discover that they're grieving things they didn't even realize that trauma had touched. So they're no longer only saying, I'm grieving what happened to me. They're saying, I'm grieving what happened to my life because of it. And that's a fundamentally different realization. And there's grief when you finally understand why. This may be one of the cruelest parts of healing. Before you understand your adaptations, you might simply think, I'm terrible at relationships. I'm lazy. I'm too sensitive. I'm indecisive. I'm needy. I'm cold. I'm different. But then you learn about attachment survival responses like hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, cognitive distortions, avoidance, disassociation, trauma bonds, negative bias. And then suddenly decades of your life make more sense to you. There's relief in this, but there's usually always enormous grief with this as well, because knowledge arrives after many of these consequences. So you can find yourself thinking, if I had understood this 20 years ago, would my life have been different? And the truth is, nobody can answer that question, but people still grieve it.
Can losing connection eventually affect identity, confidence, relationships, and opportunities?
It can. Human development happens partly through relationships. If I don't feel safe, valued, or supported, I may spend energy surviving that someone else gets to spend exploring, learning, connecting, taking risks. That doesn't determine my entire future, but this is one of the most important parts of consequential grief, because loss rarely stays contained to the thing that was originally lost. One loss can alter how a person relates to themselves, other people, their future. And over time, the secondary loss can become just as painful as the original wound, but it can influence it too. The loss of connection may become the loss of belonging. Imagine a child growing up in a family where emotional connection is inconsistent. It's unsafe, it's conditional, or it's absent even. Maybe nobody asks what they feel. Maybe affection depends on behavior. Maybe addiction conflict, illness, abuse, neglect, or emotional unavailability consumes the household. So the child doesn't necessarily think I'm experiencing emotional disconnection. They experience I'm alone. No one understands me. My feelings don't matter. I have to handle things myself. There isn't really a place for me here. And connection is more than having people physically around you. You can sit at a dinner table with your entire family and still feel completely disconnected. When connection repeatedly fails, a person may eventually stop expecting it. They stop reaching. They hide. They hide vulnerable parts of themselves because they become hyper independent. They become the caretaker instead of the person being cared for. They learn to perform whatever version of themselves gets the best response. And eventually the question changes from why can't I connect with these people to where do I belong? Do you want to take a break?
No, I'm good.
This is the next loss. The loss of connection becomes the loss of belonging. Belonging tells us there's a place where I'm known. There are people with whom I can be myself. I don't have to earn my right to exist here. But without it, people sometimes become lifelong observers of other people's lives. They can have friendships and still feel outside of themselves. They can have a family and still feel like the odd one out. They can enter a room and immediately scan for evidence that they don't fit in. They may become extremely sensitive to exclusion, rejection, changed facial expressions, unanswered text, social media interactions, or shifts in somebody's tone. Not because they're too needy, but because their nervous system has learned that belonging is fragile. And when belonging feels fragile enough, people often begin changing themselves to preserve it. And that's where the next loss happens. The loss of belonging can become the loss of identity. Human beings develop identity partly through relationships. Children learn, this is who I am. This is what I'm good at. This is what I believe. These are my boundaries. These are my preferences. But what happens when believing yourself threatens belonging? You adapt. You become agreeable. You become quiet. You become funny. You become useful. You become successful. You become invisible. You become whatever keeps relationships stable. And after years of doing this, something strange can happen. You become very skilled at reading everyone else and surprisingly disconnected from yourself. So someone asks, what do you want? And you genuinely don't know. What do you like? You're not sure. What do you believe? Depends on who you're with. What would you do if nobody were disappointed? You've never considered that. That isn't just indecisiveness. Sometimes it's the consequence of spending years organizing yourself around attachment instead of identity. And that's a grief on its own, because healing may involve realizing I became who I needed to be to belong. And somewhere along the way, I lost track of who I actually was. So the loss of identity can become the loss of confidence. Confidence requires some internal reference point. I know what I think. I know what I want. I trust my perception. I can make a decision and tolerate somebody disagreeing with it. But if your identity has been shaped around other people's reactions, confidence becomes incredibly difficult. You start outsourcing your judgment. What do you think I should do? Was that okay? Are you mad at me? Do you think I'm overreacting? Was that stupid? You might make a decision and immediately doubt yourself. You might receive criticism and completely abandon your own position. You might need reassurance even when you already know the answer. You might compare yourself constantly because you have no stable internal measure of enough. And every time that you distrust yourself, confidence erodes a little more. And this is where cognitive distortions can become incredibly relevant. If you already believe I'm probably wrong, other people know better, I make bad decisions, I'll embarrass myself, people are judging me, then opportunities begin feeling like threats. And this can bring us basically to our next loss, the loss of confidence. This can become loss of opportunities. This part can hurt deeply when someone recognizes it later, because a lack of confidence doesn't only affect how you feel about yourself, it affects what you attempt. You don't apply. You don't audition. You don't go back to school. You don't start the business. You don't leave the relationship. You don't speak up. You don't ask for the promotion. You don't submit the manuscript. You don't take the trip. When you walk into a room, you don't introduce yourself. You don't say yes because you're afraid you'll fail. And sometimes you don't say no either because you're afraid you're going to lose your belonging. Either way, your life gets smaller. A person doesn't have to consciously decide, I don't deserve opportunities. They may simply experience enough fear, self-doubt, avoidance, perfectionism, or anticipatory shame that opportunities quietly pass by. And often, nobody recognizes those moments as losses at the time. There is no funeral for the degree that you never pursued, no obituary for the relationship you never allowed yourself to have, no sympathy card for the career that you were too afraid to attempt, no memorial for the version of you who might have walked through a particular door. Those losses are invisible until someday they're not. The loss of opportunities becomes grief over the future. Eventually, a person may begin looking backward and realizing that their past altered the shape of their future. And this is where consequential grief can become almost existential. They aren't only grieving what happened, but they're grieving what didn't happen because of what happened. Maybe they're thinking, what would my life look like if I had believed in myself? What would I have, who would I have married? Would I have stayed? Would I have left sooner? Would I have gone to college? Would I have traveled? Would I have become a different kind of parent? What would I have taken more risks? Would I have trusted better people? Would I have spent fewer years trying to prove my worth? These questions can be devastating because there's no way to answer them. You're grieving a counterfactual life, a life that exists only in the imagination. And this can create a particular complicated grief because the person that you're grieving never actually existed. But neither did the marriage, the career, the home, the friendship, the confident version of you, the alternate future. And yet the emotional loss can be completely real. This is why consequential grief can feel enormous. The original loss may have happened at one point in time, but its consequences can stretch across decades. One experience can create a chain. So the chain, that's also going to be in the workbook. Belonging, adaptive identity, opportunity, grief over the life that may have been. And every link in that chain can generate another loss. And that's why somebody can begin healing and suddenly feel more grief, not less. They're finally seeing the entire picture. Before, they may have known my childhood was difficult. Now they understand my childhood affected how I attached to people. That affected who I became. Who I became affected what I believed. I believed, what was I capable of? It affected that. What I believed affected the choices that I made. Those choices affected the life that I built. And then comes the painful realization that this touched almost everything. That realization deserves grief. You can grieve the person that you did not become without concluding that there is nobody left to become. You can grieve lost opportunities while still recognizing opportunities that exist now. You can grieve the years that you spent without confidence while beginning to develop confidence today. You can grieve the identity that you constructed for survival while slowly discovering what remains when you no longer organize yourself entirely around being accepted. And maybe the most important transition in this whole episode is I cannot change what the consequences took from me, but I can decide how much more they are allowed to take. And that doesn't erase grief. It gives grief somewhere to go, because the goal isn't to convince someone that nothing was lost. Something was lost. Sometimes, many times, things were lost. The goal is helping someone recognize that mourning an unlived life and building a remaining life are allowed to happen at the very same time. Because healing can give us language for things that we couldn't understand before. But sometimes that language also shows us that those experiences costed us. And I don't want to rush that and say, hey, but look at everything that you can still do. Because before you move forward, sometimes you need permission to say, I lost something. Maybe I lost years. Maybe I lost confidence. Maybe I lost relationships. Maybe I lost opportunities. Maybe I lost parts of myself, and maybe I'm grieving a version of my life that I will never know. And this deserves to be acknowledged. But there's another side of this conversation that we haven't gotten to yet. We've only scratched the surface here. Because once that you've recognized what you've lost, you also have to figure out how to live with knowing it. What happens when the people you're grieving are still alive? What happens when you're angry because nobody came? When you watch other people receive the family support, the belonging, or the opportunities that you desperately wanted and didn't receive? What happens when the coping mechanism that helped you survive becomes the thing that you eventually have to let go of? And what happens when healing finally makes you feel emotions that you spent years trying not to feel? Because sometimes recognizing the loss is the only way, it's the only beginning of grief.
So realizing what happened doesn't automatically make you feel better?
No. Sometimes understanding your story actually hurts before it helps, because now you can see it. And once you see it, you may finally have to grieve it. But grieving the life that you didn't get doesn't mean that you're giving up on the life that you still have. It means that you're finally allowing yourself to tell the truth about both. Something was lost and something still remains. Unfortunately, we've pushed this past time like I said, we've barely even scratched the surface here. So I hope that you'll be present next week, because this obviously is going to flow into another episode, a continuation for part 2. So in this next episode, we're going to talk about what it actually looks like to carry that grief, the anger, the loneliness, the people who didn't show up, the emotions that we learned to shut down, the coping mechanisms that we depended on, and what happens when we finally allow ourselves to feel what we couldn't feel then. Because some grief doesn't begin when somebody dies. Sometimes grief begins when you finally understand what you survived and what surviving costed you. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Unapologetically Reborn. Please follow us and make sure that you're present for next week's episode. It's much more in depth, I feel, than this one. Anything you want to add?
No.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is where survival ends and choices begin.
They talked about addiction for years and years. The bottles, the bruises, the anger, the tears, the highs and the lows, the breaking apart, but seldom discussed what it did to a heart. Not the heart of the addict alone in the fight, but the child lying awake almost every night. The child learning silence instead of trust. The child taught survival because they must. The child counting footsteps, reading each tone, trying to predict if the house felt like home. The child growing older but never quite free, still carrying fear no one else could see. Some never touched substances, smoke, or a drink, yet still lived much closer to darkness than think. Because addiction does not simply stay inside one person and fade away. It lingers in children who learn to hide pain, who smile on the outside while drowning in rain, who grow into adults still searching to find why anxiety follows the back of their mind, why love feels unsafe, why peace feels so strange, why their whole nervous system braces for change. And somewhere inside them still echoes the plea, can somebody finally understand me? That question became a book for the children who learned to disappear, who carried survival for year after year, for the adults still asking, why am I this way? While carrying wounds they still hide today. Its pages were written to help people see the child underneath all the anxiety, to show them their struggles did not make them weak, but came from the chaos they never could speak. Because children can survive almost anything true, but surviving too long changes something in you. Wounds ignored do not just fade, they follow every choice we've made. Through anxious hearts and sleepless nights, through endless internal hidden fights. Unapologetically Unseen by Alicia Lynch. On Kindle for free starting May 23.